and welcome. I'm Trisha G. I'm live at DPE Tour London. I am here with, I've forgotten how to change the cameras. I am here with Holly Cummins, with whom I'm co-presenting on Developer Joy, and is Developer Joy contradictory to developer productivity? But what I wanted to talk to you today about was, because you work with a Quarkus team, I wanted to talk to you about Develocity from Gradle and Quarkus, because you're using Quarkus for Develocity with Quarkus, right?
We are, yeah. So I can give a bit of background on that. I wasn't actually involved in the doing, but I am a beneficiary of it, which is quite nice. So Quarkus, it's a large project. We've got almost 1,000 community contributors. And so as you can imagine, there's a lot of components. And when you run a build, we've got it parallelized across a zillion GitHub actions, but it still takes about 4 hours elapsed time. And the total machine time is big, over 24 hours. I don't know what it is, but big. And so that's kind of annoying. But it was starting to become a real problem, because what would happen was that we had a lot of contributors, each running these very large builds, and then we'd need to do a release. And so we'd be trying to get the release builds through on a release schedule, and Guillaume couldn't actually get the hardware. So then he'd start canceling our builds, which was the right thing to do because the release takes priority. But then, you'd sort of end up with this apologetic message saying, I canceled your build because I couldn't do anything because there was too many builds running. And so it was just sort of starting to become quite unwieldy. And we'd tried to do the things so that it would only build what it needed to build, but it still seemed to always end up building everything every time. And so it was just becoming a drag on our velocity. So Guillaume started working with the Develocity team, putting in the caching, and then we started to get these improvements. And now where we are is that there's never a queue for a build machine, and the builds run quicker, and Guillaume is less stressed because he can do his releases and that kind of thing. So what I found interesting about the whole thing was it wasn't just a benefit for the build times, which is what I thought it was going to be a benefit for. It was this sort of much bigger, more holistic benefit where it meant that we had less contention on the machines, we could get the feedback faster, we could do the releases more reliably with less sort of stress and chaos. And then as well, of course, there's a sustainability aspect, which is something that I look at a lot with Quarkus, which is, every build we were running over 24 hours of tests that didn't need to be run, and it was just pure waste. And so now we've managed to get rid of a lot of that waste.
Yeah, I wanted to explore that kind of, I think that's interesting because I spend a lot of time talking about the build cache and how we can speed up builds, and faster builds is good because fast feedback. But I think that what you've touched on is actually a more important benefit, but a bit more intangible. It's about things like queuing time. It's not just about waiting for the build, because obviously like a 4-hour build, I mean, it's a long time, right? Yeah. It is a long time, but you're like, okay, that's fine. I just won't worry about it. I can definitely do something else during those 4 hours. But if it gets pushed back in the queue, and if then something fails and you've already spent like another day on something else, and the context switching, and then the release process and everything else. So the speeding up of the build times is obviously great in its own right, but there's the knock-on effects of the reduction in frustration and toil and all those things we talk about.
And there's another sort of knock-on effect, which I completely hadn't anticipated, which is it wasn't like a thing where we started it and then the next day we just were completely there. But that kind of slight failure and slight difficulty was actually another benefit of the process that we completely hadn't thought about, because the reason we had to do some work was because our builds had various places where they just weren't reproducible. And so the cache went, is this the same thing that you built last time? And that's not ideal, right? And so we ended up doing lots of work to make our builds more reproducible, which then when you think about sort of secure supply chain and all that kind of thing, ends up being a benefit for that. So even though we weren't trying to make our builds more secure, it was kind of a happy side effect of doing the Develocity work.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I find interesting about this is for me, I've always been kind of vaguely interested in the build process, but that's not why I joined Gradle. But I'm not one of those people who owns the build, Yeah. I'm like a usual developer who just kind of like, the build is there and it's kind of fine. What I like about Develocity and the idea that it kind of forces the team to think about the performance of the build is you start thinking of the build as a production level item, as something that deserves love, attention, and like continuous improvement. And so yes, you start looking at the build cache. Why is the cache missing? And it's because we're using dynamic dependencies, or because it's resolving different dependencies, or because I'm generating random timestamps, or stuff that in retrospect you shouldn't be doing that anyway, you know. So it does force you to look at things, and you get side effect benefits that you haven't necessarily thought about at all. And the other thing is, because obviously that's the performance side of stuff, but there's the testing side of stuff as well, in terms of when you start looking at the performance of your tests and how your tests run, then you start paying attention to how your tests are written, and are they parallelizable? Are you trampling all over each other? Are you doing best practice with the tests? So one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, so you've talked about using the build cache. Are you using any of the test acceleration stuff as well? You don't know the answer to that question.
I'm just thinking, but actually I realize I do, again, only from the sort of the user perspective.
Right.
Because we have the classic problem that you get with any large project, which is flaky tests.
Right.
And our workflow for flaky tests used to be, Guillaume, is this a known flaky test?
Right.
And you can imagine.
Does he do any work, or does the boy guy just answer questions and cancel builds?
He's just team hero. Everybody needs a team hero. Guillaume is our team hero. But, you know, it's not a very scalable way of doing it. And so then you end up as well with, you know, the sort of the chatter of like, hey, I just saw this test fail. Does anybody know if it's a flaky thing? And so it ends up, you know, sort of like having these kind of ripples.
And forcing other people to context switch as well, not just you.
Exactly, yeah. And I have to debug other people's flaky tests because I need to try and figure out. And so now I just get a nice report that says, you did run a huge amount of tests. One or two of them failed, but it's not your problem. I'm like, yes.
As you know, I have a big thing about flaky tests.
Yeah.
Because I hate it. If a test is lying to me, if it fails and I don't know if it really failed, that's useless to me.
What's the point?
It's worse than useless. It's interrupted me but given me no information, nothing I can do anything about.
Yeah.
So I'm glad to hear that the Develocity flaky test thing is helpful, because then not only do you know if your test is flaky, you also get the report which says, why don't you attack this one? It's like super flaky.
Yeah.
So yes, that's good. I'm really glad to hear it. But also you've touched on something which is a common problem for Develocity users. I'm actually not going to explain what Develocity is for people who don't know what Develocity is. You can read about that somewhere else. But we have a classic problem for developer users of Develocity, is that if you're not using the dashboards for things like flaky tests, and you're a beneficiary of the performance improvements like the build caching, or you could be using the test acceleration technologies and not know about them, you're actually using a technology that's really helping you and you have no idea. And it's really hard for us to sell that. We're like, your build times are much faster because of us. And they're like, we don't believe you.
Yeah, I haven't done the work.
Yeah, I can't see it. And like, no, you can't see it. That's the point.
Yeah.
Well, I'm really pleased to hear about Develocity with Quarkus, because I have like a 4-hour test cycle time does sound like quite a lot. What is it down to now?
Before we talked, I wanted to find the statistics and I didn't. But I think more stuff is coming out about it soon.
I think we have both independently talked about performance problems and solving performance problems. And I think one of the things that I like about Develocity is that it gives you that measure, don't guess thing about the performance of your builds, which we didn't have visibility over. So it is an incremental thing. Like if you use Develocity straight away and turn on the build cache, it might help straight away, but it also helps you keep making those incremental changes. It's not just job done. You could be like, right, what's next?
Yeah, definitely. So I can see for us, we've sort of, we've turned it on and we've got that big initial improvement, and now we're just sort of continuing to incrementally work through and find the bits where we have the cache misses, or use it to identify the flaky tests and hunt them down, and solve them, and use it to identify the areas of the build that are slower and that kind of thing.
Right, I'm going to change subject now, unless you have anything else to say on that. But it's a cool story, because Quarkus is an interesting project anyway. Everyone's they've heard of it, they know it's cool, it's done by cool people, and to hear that our tool can benefit that is a good thing to hear.
Yeah, actually, I will just say one more thing about it as well, because unlike you, I think in the past I have done a lot of build work, and when a build gets to a certain size, then usually the team members start complaining, and the suggestion is usually, okay, well, why don't we divide this up? Why don't we move away from the mono repo and have 600 repositories? And
And you've got 600 more problems.
Well, exactly. That sort of, that fragmentation creates its own problem, but then it really creates a problem in terms of if you have dependencies between these things, do you test them all together or do you test them separately, and then you end up testing them separately, and then your feedback cycle is slower because you broke something, but you don't find out till their build ran with your thing. And so what I really like is that, at one extreme you have test everything together all the time, which is slow. And at the other extreme you say, if you don't run your tests, you don't have a problem,
right.
which,
it's perhaps not the answer we were looking for.
Yeah, because you do want that connectedness. And so what I like with the Develocity is that sort of that intelligence of that approach to say, well, let's just run the things that we need to,
right.
but let's actually run the things that we need to instead of shoving them off into another repository and pretending that they don't exist.
Right. So I was at the London Java Community Unconference yesterday, which I haven't been to for about 12 years, and I had a bunch of conversations about testing with those folks and about like testing pyramid and testing services, integration testing, everything, all those sorts of things that you're talking about. Do we mono repo so that we can more easily like just use stuff together, or do we like have all these services but then we have to test all the dependencies? And they looked at me like I had an answer. I'm like, it depends. But I do want to follow up a little bit on the thing about only run the tests that you need to run. So I'm going to use this as a segue into something we want to talk about. So Develocity has the predictive test selection stuff, which is a machine learning thing, which will learn from your own CI, like which tests are affected by particular changes, and therefore only run a subset. Are you using that on Quarkus?
I think so, yeah. I think we're just sort of starting that journey.
I love this idea because I love the idea of instead of having to do too much management of your tests or deleting of tests, you can kind of just use that to be like, we'll just run the ones that matter. But this allows us to segue into AI. AI is an amazing productivity technique which will help us to run tests faster, write code faster, and will ultimately also replace us as developers. Thoughts?
Not quite. See, I mean, I think sometimes what you can end up with in AI is actually, when badly applied, I think it can make all of the problems that we've just been talking about worse, because you end up with, I will use AI to write my tests. And so then instead of having a small number of tests that are slow, you have a huge number of tests that don't necessarily give you any more confidence.
And are badly written.
And are badly written, and they're even slower. So I think there's some things that we should be using AI for. And I think there's some things that we should not be using AI for. And sometimes, of course, telling the difference is not so easy. So it's really tempting to use AI to generate code because we think we're paid to generate code. And you can use AI to generate so much code at such speed. But we're pretty good at generating code. AI has a tendency to write lots of code, which a good, skilled senior developer will not do. They will be deleting code instead of writing code. But some of that other stuff, like what you just said, AI is really good for, like that pattern matching of what affects what. If you ask a person to do it, they will do it wrong, almost certainly, because they'll bring their assumptions in that kind of thing. So that's such a wonderful, and it's a bit tedious to do as well. So it's such a wonderful task for AI to do. And then that leaves us to be sort of working on that kind of bigger thing of like, oh, well, let me design this. Let me do the fun bits.
Right. And I think we were talking a bit about how to use AI to generate code. And I can't remember how much of that we've left in our presentation, but we were talking a bit about that. But using it to generate tests, yes, if it's legacy code and you would like some tests, it's a good starting point. But using AI to generate test data seems like a really good idea.
Yeah.
The monotonous thing that you're talking about.
And as well, generating test data, I think that's one where probably the AI will do a better job than you, because we bake in our assumptions, of course no one has a space in their last name and that kind of thing. And hopefully, the AI will.
It's somewhere where a little bit of stupidity is a good thing.
Yes, right? Yes, that's exactly it. I remember my first developer job, I was not using AI because this was many, many years ago, but I was using random string generation to generate test data. And we had sort of a shared database, which probably wasn't a good idea, but we were where we were.
This is 500 years ago.
Yeah.
That was best practice.
And I remember I got into trouble with one of the other developers because, this sort of conversation was, well, your test data keeps breaking my code. I'm like, well, no, I think your code is broken. My test data just
has found the broken bit.
You should be thanking me.
Yes. When I worked at Ford, we were doing a website, and it had to work it was for Ford of Europe. So we generated it with all the English language stuff, and then we had to internationalize it. And then all the German words came along and didn't fit in our buttons. It was kind of difficult. It's a good idea to think about cases outside of your own experience.
Yeah.
Yes. So yeah, AI is good for that kind of thing. And the thing that we were kind of talking about in that presentation was like, and we mentioned it again today, is generating code what we do? Is that really where we bring value? Like you said, I mean, we have IDEs. Obviously, I've got books to sell. Where's my book? We've got books to sell. So IDEs are a good thing. We should use IDEs to generate code. And the temptation is to fall into this trap of measure developers based on how much code they generate, and then an AI can generate more. So like maybe they're more productive. But the question is that what we should do as developers? Is that what our core competence is?
I think it's so tempting, but it's so misguided. And I was reading a really nice blog by Ian Cooper yesterday on this topic as well. And he was saying it's such a mistake to optimize for the writing part, because that's such a small part of what we do as developers. Most of what we do as developers is debugging. It's maintaining code, it's reading code, it's understanding code. And for some of those things, the AI-generated code performs significantly worse. So I have an example that we talk about in our talk as well, actually, where I used ChatGPT to generate some Quarkus boilerplate. And it started out and it generated it really quickly, and I was delighted. And then, it sort of does the thing where it pretends to type. And so it kept going in, kept going in, kept going in, it kept going. And it was using a Quarkus programming model where the whole point of the programming model is that it eliminates the boilerplate. And the AI went, boilerplate. You want boilerplate? Let me give you all of the boilerplate. It was like, I don't want the boilerplate. Please don't give me boilerplate. But I think somehow something about the training means that there's a bias towards generating as much as possible. And I think also probably something about how we evaluate it means that there's a bias to, if we look at like 2 pages of AI generated code, we're going to go, oh yeah, that saved me a lot of work. Whereas if it's like 2 lines of AI generated code, we're like, oh, what was the point? I could do that in my IDE.
Right.
But actually that was the better code.
Right. And I wanted to explore something as well, because it's okay for writing code, but probably not optimal. I've been using a little bit of Jetbrains AI Assistant to explain code to me. Have you tried that?
I haven't, but everyone says it's really good.
It's quite interesting. I was very skeptical because I'm like, I'm a developer, I can read code.
Yeah.
But it is quite a good way of getting another point of view. And it's a little bit like getting pairing with a junior, to get a junior to say, what do you think this code does? And so whether you understand what the code does or not, if you get the AI to try and explain it to you, it's quite a good exercise in coming at it from a sort of different angle. And it can also help you if you've written readable code and then you ask the AI to explain it to you and it explains it wrong, then you realize you've not done a great job at writing readable code.
Yeah, I think that's another one where you can sort of quite effectively harness the stupidity and use it as a design tool. So you can find the bits where it gets it wrong. And then that shows that either something was wrong with your thinking, or something was wrong with the expressiveness of your code. But either way, that's wrong. Or I heard a nice story a while ago where, again, they had a legacy code base, and they thought they knew what it did. And then they pointed the AI at it, and it came back with some explanations that were wrong. And they were like, stupid AI. And then when they looked, actually, they realized, oh, the AI had it right. Our understanding was wrong. So again, you sort of want to look at where there's a difference between what the AI says and what you say. Why is that difference there?
I think that's an interesting point, because there is obviously talk about how AI can replace some of what we do, or possibly all developers. And I think I don't really feel like it's that at all. I just feel like it's obviously it's another tool, like an IDE. It's more powerful than an IDE in some ways, but it's like adding a different type of person to the team with a different set of viewpoints.
Yeah.
And it can really help us, I think, think in different ways and level up in a different way. As long as people don't think that our job is to produce code, and that our job is more like to have design discussions and to write readable code and to be able to maintain code and to write tests and have good test data, perhaps that will help us move in the right direction with AI.
I think it's a little bit like the argument against pair programming that you sometimes see in sort of upper levels of management, of like, why would I pay 2 developers when I
just sit at a keyboard, one keyboard?
Yeah. And it sort of has this assumption that the job of a developer is to type. And so 2 developers will type at half the speed of 1 developer. So it's inefficient. But of course, that's fundamentally not the job of a developer. The job of a developer is to solve problems.
I mean, I'm a big fan of pairing, as you know. Like, what I like about pairing with the 2 developers is when you're coding on your own, you're thinking about that next line of code, and it's difficult to keep the bigger context in your head. When you're pairing, you have the navigator who's thinking a little bit more ahead, and how does that impact this, and what about this, and writing stuff down while the other person's like writing the code. And that allows you to do that kind of small picture, big picture thing at the same time. It's nice. Right, and the last part of this, if we still have time, I want to talk a bit about developer joy, because that's what we wanted to talk about, and fun and play. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about developer joy, and how joy and fun and play and downtime and rest is the same as developer productivity. So do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, because when we sort of first started talking about doing a talk together, it sort of seemed like we had completely contradictory employers.
Right.
You're working on developer productivity, wring every last ounce out of the developers, and I'm working on developer joy of, let them scamper through the fields. But they're so similar, because when is a developer happiest? When they're productive. Developers absolutely hate it when they're doing things that they know are waste. And one of the things that we've tried to do with Quarkus really is focus on this idea of machine efficiency. So it starts super fast, has really high throughput, blah, 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 but also focus on this idea of human efficiency, because when you pair the two, that's when you get something really magic. And then there's a really nice synergy as well that we saw with Quarkus, which is, we've had in the past, I think, some tools where sort of, they offer like a higher level abstraction, and they seem really good in a demo, but then when you try and use it, the performance isn't good enough, or if you want to do something that's off the narrow path of the demo, then it's a real headache. And with Quarkus, I think because of how we've integrated the developer joy to the machine efficiency, the things that we do to enable the machine efficiency, like indexing, are also the exact same things that allow us to enable the developer joy, because we know what your code does at build time, so you don't have to write as much code. And so then that means that you can focus on expressing the things that you really care about, rather than writing all of the boilerplate. And it ties a little bit back to the AI conversation as well, which is, if you have the need for a whole bunch of boilerplate, you can get the AI to generate the boilerplate, but then that boilerplate is a drag on the code forever after. And if the boilerplate is so boring that the AI can write it, why is it even there? Why not get the compiler to write it, or have it done at build time? Because then you end up with a much more sort of readable, expressive code. You have happy developers, and you have higher performance. So it's like a quadruple win.
Yeah, I remember when I first started going to conferences in about 2011, and lots of people from the non-Java world were complaining about Java because it's boilerplate heavy and all that. And I was like, I don't really care, because like, I have an IDE that helps me with that, and my brain sort of like edits out the boilerplate because I know how to read it. But over the last I've really changed my mind over the last 10, 12 years in terms of like, yes, but if it's not there, I don't have to edit it out in my mind. I can just read the relevant bits. It is important, I think, to reduce that cognitive load. Developer joy, product. Yes.
Sorry.
No, yes.
One more thing about that. I think going back to your idea of having that external perspective, because I think that's when people who are new to Java look at it and they say, oh, there's all this boilerplate, and we go, boilerplate, what boilerplate? Because we're so used to it. And I think what the Quarkus team have done a really good job of is challenging some of those assumptions of like, oh, this has always been there, it has to be there. Well, what if it didn't have to be there? Oh, yeah, you're right, it doesn't have to be there.
Yeah, I liked it with when they introduced records, and they decided that records they don't need the get and the set keyword. They don't need the get keyword on the getter. And I was like, that's like sacrilege. And I'm like, how can you tell the difference between the method and the field? Like, because it's got brackets. That's the difference between the method and the field. Like, why are we so holding on to these sacred cows?
Yeah.
It's not necessary. Boilerplate, yes, and making room for boredom. So this is where we're talking about the possible tension between DPE, which is like automate all the things so that you can squeeze more out of developers, versus versus the get rid of the rubbish so that they can be free and skip through the fields. And it's all about perception, isn't it? When I'm trying to talk about developer productivity engineering, my hope is that using an engineering approach to get rid of the toil and the frustration, the long build times and all the rest of it will free you up to have that like creativity. But I think that's possibly, I don't want to say a difficult sell, but that's something that I think we need to be able to put across as an industry the idea of like making the space for the creativity. It's not about stopping you from typing these things so you can type more other things. It's about creating that space for play and thinking and creativity, and that's what we have in the talk.
Yeah, and I think it's really about recognizing that we work in a creative industry, and so we work better if we are not completely, sort of ground to a pulp by an oppressive workload, and we work better if we have time to think about things. Because I do my best problem solving, and I draft all of my emails, and I write all of my talks, and I solve my hardest problems when I'm running or walking or away from the keyboard. And so I think we kind of need to understand a little bit about the sort of the psychology and how people work, and then say, if we allow a little bit of time that's not really aggressively measured, actually we're going to get a better outcome than if we focus just on the metrics for what was easy to measure and didn't think about that bigger picture of what problem are we trying to solve.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was going to wrap up round about there, unless there's anything else you wanted to talk about at this point.
No.
Okay, well, thank you very much for being interviewed and grilled and promoting Develocity to our viewers. It's great.
Well, thank you very much for Develocity. It has personally made my life happier. So
that is what we like to hear. Happy. It's all about developer happiness. Yes, thank you. And thank you to our viewers. And we will see you in the next BPL.